Hello. Today's lecture is on the major issues. All right, and so welcome to Introductory Behavioral Neuroscience. Right, this is our first recorded lecture, and just as a reminder, as you go through these video lectures, it is recommended that you take notes, just as if you were sitting in class. Often when this class is taught, it's taught as a large lecture, and students would be one of maybe 100 students sitting in a large lecture classroom. And there's going to be elements in these lectures where I will ask you some questions. If we were all sitting and doing this in person, I would often ask people to respond using clickers, which is a type of device where you can make multiple choice type responses, and I'll have some questions in here, right? And obviously you won't be able to click in, but you can think about what your response would be when we get to those kinds of questions. All right, so you want to take notes either freehand or using the guided lecture notes that are provided, so that you can upload them for credit. Okay, so major issues in the study of the brain. That's where we're going to start. And so here's our warm-up. So question for you: what does the brain have to do with psychology? Let you read that on your own. And if you tire of these questions, you can always fast forward, right? Or if you need more time, you can pause it. Or if you ever want to go back, right? All the things that you can do with a recorded lecture. But, right, the brain has to do with all of these things: our thinking, our behavior, our emotions. All the different topics that we study as psychologists are related to our brain, or the functioning of our brains. All right. I'm going to start this class. It's an introductory lower division level course, and I want to talk a little bit about how to study for exams in this course, especially because this course is lower division, and because studying, right, is something that is in the research area for psychologists. I want to make sure that we as students of psychology know everything that we should about the literature on how to study well. All right, so here are a few tips. Right, so when I'd be teaching this class in person, I'd ask people, right, to respond, to let me know how they study, right? So you can just think to yourself, how do you study? Do you read the text? Hope so. Do you reread? Do you highlight your text and or take notes? Do you take notes to summarize the text, and perhaps to summarize the notes that you take in class? Do you review your notes before an exam? Do you use note cards to help you summarize the material from the text and from lectures? Do you answer questions to study guides? Right. These are some of the most typical answers that I get if I do this as a free response for students. All right. What most of those answers have to do is that what they share in common is that what most students do when they're reviewing for an exam, they're studying for exam, they spend most of their time experiencing and then re-experiencing and reviewing the material, and they spend relatively little time testing themselves. All right, and so the number one suggestion that I have for you, that's really backed up by the literature in the scientific literature in psychology, is that given that you have a finite amount of time to study, spend less of your time reviewing, that is rereading, right, and just looking over your notes, and spend more of your time actually testing yourself. All right, so this is taken from your syllabus, right? So there's a link in here for a formal way to test yourself, but you don't really need to use a formal method if you use flashcards, right, and actually test yourself on your knowledge for key terms, or if you use the blank page and simply try to recall as much as you can from a specific lecture or chapter in the text, right, and to write down, right, and to summarize as much as you can. That works as well. You can answer, right, not just review, but practice answering questions from study guides. All of those work well as methods for testing yourself. Other things that certainly work are that you want to study consistently across the entire semester, right? You don't want to study and cram just before exams, right? And the suggestion here is that if you spend the same amount of time but simply spread it out, you'll get more out of, right, that amount of time, and you'll learn more than if you spent that time cramming right before an exam, studying with other people. I realize under current circumstances that might be more difficult, but almost anything that's challenging or hard, right, or takes a little bit of motivation, whether it's studying or an exercise regimen or whatever it might be, it's often easier to do with other people. Okay, one suggestion is to use the structure and materials in the text effectively, right? Your textbook and almost all textbooks have outlines, keywords, review questions, study guides, right? There are elements in there to help you study and to help you test yourself, and students often ignore them. Right? This one is fairly obvious. Spend an adequate amount of time on task and come to office hours, or right? Ask questions when you have them. All right, so I'm not going to go through all of this in a tremendous amount of detail because I think you've already got the basic idea in the summary. Test yourself more, all right? But this is the take-home message. To improve your learning, test yourself more frequently. One of the very early American psychologists and philosopher, William James, wrote about this. If you read this quotation from him, so it's not necessarily a new idea that testing yourself leads to better memory. All right. So, couple reasons why testing yourself, and especially testing yourself repeatedly, helps you to learn. The one is kind of more obvious. If students know they're going to be tested regularly, they study more, space their studying throughout the semester, right? Those were some of our suggestions for studying, rather than concentrating it just before exams, and that helps. But this one is not as obvious, and it's actually a lot more important. The act of testing has a powerful positive effect on future retention. That is, testing yourself leads to much stronger memory than simply reviewing the same material. All right, so what's been called by psychologists the testing effect has been studied, right? Lots of different types of research. Here's a classic study by Karpicki and Rudiger from 2006. So they studied the testing effect. It is this finding that long-term retention or long-term memory is best when information is repeatedly tested during the learning. All right, so here's a description of the study they had. They had 3 groups, and this is a good study because they had students who were learning some material from a text, right? So the kind of thing that college students are often asked to study. All right, and so the first group here, called the repeated study group, they studied 4 times in a row. That's why you see these 4 S's, right? So they had a short period of time, right? 10 minutes, where over and over again, 4 times they were allowed for 10 minutes to simply repeatedly study the passage. So the passage was read 4 times, and there was no testing at all. All right, the second group here was allowed to study the material 3 times, and they took 1 test. All right, and then the last group here only got to see the material once, and then they took 3 tests, right? So all 3 groups had 4 blocks, same amount of time, 10 minutes each. All right, and they differed only in how often they tested themselves on the material versus just re-experiencing the material. All right, in this study, they found that repeated study was most effective if you're going to be tested, right? If you're going to take your exam immediately. So if there was a really short retention interval. And for the group that repeatedly studied 4 times, at learning, this group expected the best long-term memory. So when the groups were asked, how well did you learn it? How well do you think you'll do on the exam? The group that got to study 4 times rated themselves as having learned the material really well, and they considered, when they rated, they considered the least effortful and demanding condition, right? It didn't take a lot of effort to just reread that material 4 times. However, the repeated testing condition, the condition in which the test was taken 3 times, is the most effective at a long retention interval, right? So an interval that's not actually immediate. We'll see what it is in this study in just a second, right? And this is what is described as the testing effect. That testing yourself repeatedly leads to better long-term memory, all right? And in this study, during the test period, the participants were given a test sheet with the title of the to-be-recalled text passage printed at the top, and were asked to write down as much of the material from the passage as they can remember. All right, so they were basically just given a blank sheet of paper, right? So nothing complicated, and they were just asked to recall as much of the material as they could, right? So a basic free recall test. Here's what the results look like in graphical form, right? So there were 2 types of tests shown on the left here. Immediate, right? After all of those blocks, those 4 blocks, they got their exam 5 minutes later. Or, right, long term, over here on the right, the exam was given a week later. All right, and what you can see is when the test was immediate, right, here's the percentage of ideas that were recalled, right, so here's better memory, and you can see when the test was done immediately after all the blocks, memory was better than it was a week later. All right, and when the tests were immediate, 5 minutes right after the blocks were done, it was the group that studied who did the best, and the group that studied and then took 3 recall tests in a row, right, did a little less well. But 1 week later, right, a week after all of that learning was completed, it was the group that had tested themselves 3 times, right, and only studied once, who had the best retention of the material. In fact, their retention of the material, right, was almost twice as good as it was for the group that studied, right, spent the same amount of time but studied 4 times, right? So that difference there is the testing effect, and the difference between the group that tested themselves repeatedly and the group that only studied is huge, right? So almost twice as much was learned by the group that tested themselves repeatedly, and compared to all the other things you could do, spacing your study, study with a friend, all of those are good ideas, but the testing effect has a much larger, it makes a much bigger difference in how much is learned compared to almost anything else I could suggest that you do. All right, this is another study, very similar, all right, where in this case there was one group that just studied twice, or they took a study test, right? So it was a little bit simpler. But this shows, right, same result if you have an immediate test at 5 minutes. The group that just does nothing but study, their performance is a little bit better. But here, right, and at a week, you can see that the group that tested themselves even just once had much better memory. But you can see that the testing effect shows up even after just a couple of days. So you don't have to wait an entire week. At almost any interval where, right, if it's not cramming right before the exam, then testing yourself is going to be a better use of your time than just repeatedly studying. All right. So these results are counterintuitive. They go against how we think memory works for the most part. So our intuition is usually is that learning is usually thought to occur during episodes of studying, whereas retrieval of information on testing simply serves to assess, to figure out what you've learned. But in fact, right, testing yourself or practicing your retrieval of the information is actually a powerful memory enhancer, right? It often produces large gains in long-term retention relative to repeated studying, right? So the act of testing leads to much better memory. All right. So retrieval practice often produces superior long-term retention relative to studying for an equivalent amount of time, right? So everybody's looking to get more out of the time they have. This is one of the easiest ways to do it. You have a limited amount of time, get the most out of it that you can. All right, based on all these kinds of studies, I'm sort of summarizing a number of them here. But, right, testing is better than just reviewing. Repeated testing is better than taking a single test. Testing with feedback, where you know whether your answers were right or wrong, leads to even greater benefits than testing without feedback. Testing under conditions that makes retrieval easy, like a multiple choice test, doesn't improve memory as much as making the test harder, like a free recall test. The memory benefits of retrieval practice are not limited to learning of a specific response, right? So it's not that you've just memorized the material in one way and you can't generalize on it, right? Or it's not flexible in any way. It produces knowledge that can be transferred to different contexts, right? So it's one of those things, even if you get questions on the exam that don't map exactly to the way in which you learned the material, there's still a benefit to the testing effect. All right. So do you think you might need to teach other people at some point, right, after, or in your future, right? So maybe you will be a teacher and you're going to teach students, or maybe you're going to be a therapist and you're going to have to teach something to your clients or patients, right? Or you're a coach, or you're on a team and you're going to teach something to your teammates or your colleagues, or you're going to be parents at some point and you're going to teach something to your children, right? And the answer to this is, everybody's going to have to teach something to other people at some point in their future, right? So if your answer is yes, and it should be yes, then you just learned something that can help benefit you right now as a student, so you can maximize your time and learn better, but you also learn something that will help you to be a better teacher in your future. All right. So what do you think is the greatest barrier to people testing themselves more often, or to you testing yourself more often, right? One of the things when people do this kind of research they find is hard is, even after you sort of tell students this, right, they don't necessarily test themselves more. All right. All right. And I'll just say, right, I don't know what the reason might be for you, but the reason that a lot of students give is that it's easier to just review the material and it's too much work to test themselves, right? It's harder, right, and they don't want to do it, right? But it seems like a lot of the benefit comes, all right, the harder the test is, the more benefit you get, right? So like in working out, as they say, no pain, no gain. So, all right, so those are my, a few suggestions for studying for this class and for others. Let's go on to our first topic that has to do with the major issues, right? This is in that introductory section in your text, by the way. All right, so for starters, right, this class is Introductory Behavioral Neuroscience. If you look at textbooks in this area, they have a number of different names. So this field in this area gets called a number of different things. It also gets called biological psychology, psychobiology, physiological psychology, mind and brain, and goes by other names as well. No matter what the name, this is all the study of the physiological and genetic basis of behavior. In this area, the emphasis is placed upon physiological, evolutionary, and developmental mechanisms as they relate to behavior, and a strong emphasis is placed upon the functioning of the brain. All right, so in this, in your text, they say that biological explanations of behavior, trying to explain a particular behavior, can fall into four different categories. All right, so these will be important to know. There are physiological explanations of behavior, where there's an emphasis on trying to explain behavior based on the functioning of the brain or other vital organs. There's an autogenetic type of explanation, where this describes a behavior based on the development of a particular structure or behavior, So I think the term, when I see ontogenetic here, what I think is developmental, That's the term that most of us are more familiar with. So you see ontogenetic, think developmental. All right. There are evolutionary explanations of behavior that focus upon the evolutionary history of a behavior, So we might see it in modern humans, but perhaps the behavior evolved, earlier in our evolutionary history. All right, and then lastly, there are functional explanations of behavior that describe why a structure or a behavior evolved as it did. So functional and evolutionary are often highly related to each other. All right, so let's start with an example. Have you ever experienced goosebumps, where the hair, for instance, on your arm stands on end? Technical term, piloerection. All right, goosebumps. When does this tend to happen, For most people, it can happen when you're cold, but it can also happen when you are scared, Why does it happen? So now we have a behavior, and we're looking for an explanation, We understand some of the circumstances when it happens. It happens when we're scared, and now we're looking for an explanation. So we want to go back into, some of those possibilities. And here is one explanation for why this occurs, and it occurs when we are scared. An evolutionary explanation for this is this behavior, piloerection, when you're scared, goosebumps, makes a lot more sense if you look at other mammals. So in our evolutionary history, we are related to mammals that have more hair than modern humans, and so it's easiest to see why this behavior, to see this behavior, for instance, in a cat. When a cat is scared, not only does it arch its back, but you see its hair stand on end like this. When this happens, the cat appears much larger, and so a predator might think twice about attacking, a larger animal, and so this makes a lot of sense when we see it in the cat. And so the reason why this happens in humans, an evolutionary explanation, is that it was functional for mammals, at a point in time in our evolutionary history when our ancestors had more hair than we do now as modern humans. All right. Let's take another explanation. Do you know what this is? Looking at it, it might not be clear from the picture whether that is a plant or an animal, And it turns out this is a sea dragon. You can see them. You ever go to the Long Beach Aquarium? you can see these, and not only, right, do they look a little bit like a sea plant, like kelp or something, but they move in a way. Oh, let's back up here and see if I can get this. All right, let's go here. Now, I could just watch that all day because it's very relaxing, right? Extremely relaxing. So not only does the sea dragon, right, kind of resemble kelp, but it moves in a way where, right, when it's swimming, it looks as though it could be a piece of seaweed or kelp just sort of drifting along, right? So what type of explanation might that, right, of those four we just covered, might best explain the way the sea dragon moves, right? So would you say, what type of explanation would say the sea dragon moves slowly to resemble a plant and to avoid being eaten? Physiological, ontogenetic, evolutionary, or functional? Right? The best answer here would be functional, right? The function of this behavior, right? Swimming in this slow way to resemble a plant, the function is to keep the sea dragon from being eaten by meat-eating carnivorous predators. All right. Okay, so you want to review that. A deep understanding of a particular behavior is tied to being able to explain the behavior from each of the four possible perspectives or types of explanations, right? So they're not mutually exclusive. You can often understand behavior, right, and explain it with each of these types of perspectives. All right. Here's a thought experiment, right? So imagine here that there's an asteroid hurtling towards Earth, and as a result of the asteroid hitting the planet, enough sediment is kicked into the air that, right, we will only be able to support half of the Earth's present population, right? There is speculation that something like this has happened right in the history of our planet before, by the way. So in order to deal with this, right, we're going to reduce the population of the planet by 1/2. Now remember, this is a thought experiment, right? We're not going to actually do anything like this, so just think about it, right? It's a little and to be fair, we're not going to kill anyone. Everybody's going to be able to contribute. We want everyone to live on in some sense, so we're going to create hybrid beings out of every 2 people, right? And each person is going to contribute either their brain or the rest of their body, right? Everything but their brain. So if you had a choice, right, to choose what was going to live on, your brain or the rest of your body, right? What would you choose? Would you prefer to donate your brain or your body to the new hybrid being that's going to live on? Right? When I would ask this of a class, people will give both answers, but overwhelmingly most people say, I'd like to contribute my brain, right? And so if you answered that way, why? Why would you want to contribute your brain to the hybrid being? Right? And most people, right, you come up with a number of explanations, but we sort of get to the idea, and it's fairly intuitive, right? People will answer and say, well, you know, if I didn't have my foot or my hand or part of my body, I could still be me if I had my brain, right? But if I didn't have my brain, I wouldn't be me. I wouldn't have my memories. I wouldn't have my personality, right? And so they kind of get at this idea that our brains is where we live, right? Or another way to say this is where our minds live. That's why why most people would say, I would want my brain to live on in the hybrid. All right, let me ask you whether these statements make sense. I have a brain. I think with my brain. All right. Overwhelmingly, right, if I ask people, as sentences, do these just seem to make sense? Most people say, yeah, that makes sense, right? I have a brain, and I think with my brain. All right, but if you stop, right, and consider these two statements, they suggest strongly that you are separate from your brain. If you can have a brain, and you can think with your brain, right? You can use your brain. That suggests, right, that the way we normally think about this is that we are somewhere other than in our brain if we have a brain and we can think with it. All right. All of these are to, right, these questions are to get us to start thinking about one of the big questions in the study of the brain called the mind-brain, right, or the mind-body relationship. Biological explanations of behavior raise the issue of the relationship between the mind and the brain, known as the mind-body or the mind-brain problem. All right, and there's a number of different, if you take a course in philosophy, there's a number of different positions that get considered here. We're going to kind of boil it down to just the two most important, dualism and monism. All right, so dualism is the belief that there are different kinds of substances that make up the mind and the body, or the mind and the brain, and they're made up of different entities that follow different kinds of rules. Dualism was first proposed and defended by the French philosopher, the 1700s, René Descartes. And if you answered, this makes sense, I think with my brain, I have a brain, I would say you're thinking a lot like Descartes did, right, in this dualistic way. It is the most common belief, even for people who haven't studied this formally, it's the most common belief among non-scientists. But dualism, that the mind and the brain are separate types of entities following separate types of rules, are rejected by most neuroscientists or brain scientists. All right, so here's a little picture of Descartes, right, who studied dualism. All right, and so I got my dates slightly wrong. So he was living and working in the early 1600s. All right, let's get a quick, instead of me trying to give you more of an explanation in terms of the mind-body problem, let's watch a little sort of a philosophy cartoon introduction to this problem, right? And so in this particular video, they'll talk about physicalism, and physicalism, right, is one of those views contrary to dualism, right? And we're going to call that monism or materialism. All right, so give me just a second. Just get out of this.
Your passion with the world.
On September 13th, 1848, a freak accident caused an explosion that drove an iron rod straight into the skull of a worker named Phineas Gage. A metal rod almost as tall as he was went through his skull, and he didn't die. But the Phineas from before the accident and the one who lived after it didn't seem to have a lot in common personality-wise. The Phineas with no hole in his brain was a proper hard-working gentleman, and the Phineas with the injured brain was sort of a belligerent jerk. Phineas's brain was changed and his personality changed too. This misfortune has provided lots of fodder for researchers of psychology and neurology, but the case of Phineas Gage holds lessons for philosophers too. It provides us with some rare hard evidence that a part of us that's historically been thought of as non-physical, our personality, is actually directly affected by what happens to us physically. Which raises the question, where does our mind reside? Now, not a lot of contemporary scientists would be all that surprised that an injury like the one Gage suffered could cause such a radical change. That's because the dominant view held in much of Western science is what we call reductive physicalism. This is the view that the world is made only of physical stuff, including us. By this logic, everything about me and you could be explained in terms of our bodies, our brains, hormones, and neurotransmitters. So if everything about Phineas's personality could be explained in terms of his brain, it's no shock that a radical change in his brain would bring about a radical change in his personality. This same belief is at work when a psychiatrist prescribes antidepressants to a patient. Change the patient's brain chemistry, change the patient's mood. Now, physicalism may be the default scientific position, but remember way back in episode 5, our old friend René Descartes introduced us to cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes believed that he could cast doubt on the existence of his body, but not the existence of his mind. The fact that he could doubt one but not the other told him he must be made of two different kinds of stuff. This view, known as substance dualism, says the world is made of both physical stuff and mental stuff. Substance dualists say that minds are a separate non-physical substance that cannot be reduced to or explained in terms of physical stuff like brains. And in this view, some things like God are pure mind and other things like rocks are pure matter. But humans, well, we're kind of special. We're the only kind of thing that combines both stuffs into one being, both body and mind. What's more, these two substances appear to interact with each other inside of us. This is called interactionism. When I make up my mind to do something, I have the power to compel my body to do as I please, to get up off the couch and make myself a nice PB&J, for example. What's more, my mental states seem to have the ability to affect my physical states, even against my will. You ever notice how many people who are grieving or under a lot of stress, for example, often get physically sick? Likewise, our bodies also appear to be able to affect our minds, like when you're so hungry you just can't focus on what your teacher is saying at all, or how a pure physical pleasure, like having a good cuddle with your cat, can pull you out of a bad mood. Interactionists say that what's going on with these experiences is that our two substances, minds and bodies, are interacting with each other. But if you think about it, this is actually a pretty puzzling proposition. How can a purely mental thing have any effect on a purely physical thing? The puzzle of how minds and bodies can interact with each other is known as the mind-body problem. This is the problem that makes us wonder, how can my body have a separate entity called a mind lurking inside of it, controlling it and being controlled by it? What would tether my mind to this body in particular? Why couldn't my mind just go running off on its own or take a dip into other bodies to see what it's like in there? Descartes' answer, frankly, was not all that satisfying. He said that the mind is tethered to the body at the pineal gland, located at the base of the brain, and that all mind-body interactions are filtered through that portal, if you will, between the mind and the body. But that really only pushes the problem back without solving it, since the pineal gland is part of the physical body. Many modern philosophers of mind, seeing no way to solve the mind-body problem, have felt compelled to abandon substance dualism altogether. Some are happy to be physicalists, but others are convinced that there are some parts of the human experience that simply can't be boiled down to brains. To see what they think is being left out, let's head over to the thought bubble for some flash philosophy.
Okay, so that gives us a little bit of just background on the mind-body problem as introduced, right, from by a philosopher. Okay, so for most brain scientists, right, the problem with dualism is there are no good explanations for how an immaterial mind might interact with the material body, right? So here's an original drawing by Descartes, right, where this person is looking out at the arrow, the information from the arrow, right, light is bouncing off of it, and they understood enough about physiology at this point to realize, right, that the eyes, the light from the arrow is going to interact with the eyes. Information from the eyes is following the optic nerve, and drawn way out of scale here is the pineal gland. And according to Descartes, not drawn in here but added in the second picture, right, then this immaterial thing happens where the physical brain is going to interact with the non-physical mind. So the non-physical mind is going to perceive the arrow, and then the non-physical mind makes a decision. I should point at the arrow. In order to get that done, though, it has to interact with the physical body, so it sends the instruction back to the pineal gland, and through the pineal gland there's the control of the rest of the brain, and the brain controls the motor nerves, right, that control the finger, and the finger points at the arrow, right? And that was Descartes' explanation for how this happens, right? And it wasn't much of an explanation at all, right? Because there was really no way to describe how it was information got from the material pineal gland to the immaterial mind, right? And so here's a little caption here on the right that captures this idea, right? Here's a mathematician. He's got the first part of the problem worked out and the last problem worked out, but in between he simply has the phrase, and then a miracle occurs. That's sort of the dualistic explanation for what happens, right? And the scientist here says, I think you should be a little more explicit in step 2. All right, so brain scientists, right, for this and other reasons, reject the notion of dualism. All right, and if you ever, if you're into 80s music, the Police had a classic album called "The Ghost in the Machine," and right, this refers to that notion that Descartes came up with, that the mind was immaterial, like a ghost, but it was housed within the brain in the machine. All right. Okay, so if not dualism, then what, right? And so in the little video, they called the counterposition physicalism, right? Your text calls it monism, right? Monism is the belief that there's not two kinds of substances, right? One for the brain and everything else that's physical, and one for the mind, but instead the universe is comprised of only one type of substance, right? It's physical. And so the most accepted forms of monism include materialism. Everything that exists is physical by nature, therefore the mind has to be explained by the functioning of, right, physical mechanisms. And the identity position is that mental processes, or the mind, are the same as brain processes, but simply described in different ways, right? So not that the mind is a different kind of substance following different rules, a different thing. Instead, the identity position could be stated as the mind is the functioning of the brain. They're not separate things. All right, so neuroscientists often adopt the position that the mind is the functioning of the brain. Here's a quote from Endel Tolving, cognitive neuroscientist who studies memory. As a scientist, I am compelled to the conclusion that there must exist certain physical chemical changes in the nervous tissue that correspond to all psychological processes. The alternative stance, that it may be possible for any behavior or any thought to occur independently of physical changes in the nervous system, is sheer mysticism. All right. Okay, so that's where we leave off. There's a whole lot more, right? I'll just say this is one of the big questions, and there is more to be said about the mind-body problem and the mind-brain problem. Okay, so explanations of the mind-body relationship do not answer some fundamental questions, right? So if, for instance, why is consciousness a property of brain activity, right? Why do we need consciousness at all, right? Do we need it to survive. Other animals seem to survive without the same kind of consciousness that we have. What kind of brain activity produces consciousness? And how does brain activity produce consciousness? All right, so this aspect of mind, consciousness, which we are all very much aware of, there are a lot of questions right, that are unanswered about how and why the brain produces this aspect of our mental states, our conscious awareness of ourselves. Okay, and that is where we'll end this lecture.